Alright, so we're going to be talking about neurobehavioral disorders, especially in children. Now when we talk about neurobehavioral disorders, we're talking a lot about most common ones: ADHD, autism, Asperger's, some new ones out there. Reactive association disorder is what RAD stands for. The list goes on and on, really. When we look at neurobehavioral disorders, we're looking at dysfunction within the brain. The areas of the brain are just not communicating with each other like they should be. So let's take a step back and let's just look at the brain and how it functions. So this is a side view of your brain. This would be the front. This is the back. Okay? Now we've got ourselves oriented, and this would be, if we're looking at your brain from the side, this would be the left side of your brain. Now there's different areas of the brain that do different jobs, we know that. So for instance, we have to kind of divide the brain into different compartments to give us an idea of what its functions are and what it's responsible for. So we'd like to kind of take a look at dividing the brain into the front part and the back part. The back part of the brain is primarily used for sensory processing. So there's an area of the brain that's responsible for processing sound. There's another area of the brain, the back of the brain, that's responsible for processing sight. And another area of the brain that's up here towards the top that's more responsible for processing your sense of touch and where you are proprioceptively in space. And what's supposed to happen, or what does happen, is the brain takes this processing information that it's getting from its environment, packages that information together, and then sends it to the front part of the brain, where now we get to make some sort of executive decision and decide what we're going to do about this information we got from our environment. And we have some sort of motor response, a motor output to the sensory input that we're receiving. Now when we think of motor output, one of the first things we like to think of is motor output would be muscles. And so we have a muscle response to the sensory information that we're gathering from our environment. So if a bear jumps out at us in the forest, obviously we want to get our muscles primed and ready to run off to make sure that we don't get eaten by the bear. Now there's also an area of the brain that processes and gives us an emotional output. Now emotions are a motor output just like movement is a motor output. Okay? Another area we have is one that is responsible for our thoughts. This is another motor output, so those little things that go trickling through your brain throughout the day, those thoughts that we have, recurring or new ones, they are motor outputs that are a response to the sensory input we're getting from our environment. And the last thing is basically our ability to pay attention and to focus. Okay? Now there is an area in the brain whose main job is to regulate and inhibit the sensory input coming in and the motor information going out, or the response going out. If this inhibitory component of your brain is not working properly, we'll get excessive motor outputs and potentially too much sensory information coming in. So what do we see this as? Well, in our example here, if we have excessive motor output, that would be the kids that would be, remember we're talking about kids here as an example, we'll show this in more other things as well, but if you have excessive motor output, you have what? Hyperactivity. If you have excessive emotional output, there's no consistency in your emotions. You have highs, you have lows, ups, downs, nothing, you have a tough time remaining calm and steady when it comes to the emotions. With our thoughts, it's always running. It's like having that song in your head that you can't ever get out of your head, and it keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. So we have these repetitive thoughts that keep going because we can't slow them down because this part of the brain is not working again. And last part we're going to talk about is attention. Now it's not that you can't pay attention, it's that you pay attention to everything. See, this area that is inhibiting these excessive motor outputs is also responsible for inhibiting an area in the brain called the frontal eye fields. The frontal eye field is what responds to movements in your periphery. And so if you have something that's flashing in your, say, your left peripheral vision, the right side of your brain wants to push your eyes to see what's going on over in that left visual field. And the same goes in the opposite direction. What's supposed to happen is this will, if you want to attenuate or pay attention to something right in front of you, you have to inhibit those frontal eye fields from wanting to skip around and look at everything that's in the room. So when we look at or take into consideration if this scenario is happening, what do we see in our example with children that have ADHD, hyperactivity, emotional inconsistency, running thoughts, and they can't pay attention. Okay, so these issues with the kids that have ADD and ADHD, it's not necessarily that it's this genetic issue that they have, it's a functional issue. Their brain just doesn't work like it's supposed to be working. There's no pathology that's involved. When these kids have their brain scanned, it's not like you're finding tumors and seizure activity in those types of scenarios. You can't see anything on those scans because it's not a pathology, it's a functional issue. In order to fix functional problems, you have to go in and work on getting these areas of the brain that aren't working to start working again. Your brain is made up of cells, just like your muscles are made up of cells. And in order to give yourself strong muscles, you have to exercise them. The same thing goes for your brain. In order to have a strong, healthy brain, you have to exercise it. But the challenge we run into is that your brain is divided into a left and a right side. And those different areas of the brain do different things. So these are those frontal lobes that separate us from being human, that separate us, that make us human. And this little area, or the little diagram down here, is a picture of your brainstem. So essentially what we got going on here then is now we have, as I mentioned in the previous drawing, how the area in the brain that's supposed to inhibit that sensory information that's coming in and inhibit the motor output, is if it's not working, we see those scenarios that you see with ADD and ADHD kids. Well, guess what? The same thing's happening where you have autistic children, children that have RAD, children that are excessive compulsive. See, it's just different areas of the brain that aren't working. And what we're seeing is we're trying to do cognitive types of therapy with these kids, and you can't use cognitive therapy because you don't even have the basic foundational programming in their brain working properly, and doing cognitive things like schoolwork is very advanced. And if you can't even get the basic brain patterns to work, you're going to have a really tough time getting these advanced, more hierarchical types of functions out of the brain when it can't really do the easy things. So we'll talk a bit about this area in the brain. So this is an area called the midbrain. Midbrain is responsible for a lot of autonomic functions, things that we don't have to think about: heart rate, digestion, elimination, stuff like that. Well, this area of the brain stem is responsible for firing down both sides of your body, and it does things that are responsible for primarily fight or flight functions. So for instance, if a bear is chasing you, you want to increase your heart rate. You want to be able to sweat to cool yourself down. You want to be able to get more blood to your muscles and shunt it away from your digestive organs and your reproductive organs, because when a bear is chasing you, or a lot, whatever, digesting your food, reproducing, and having kids, those are not priorities. Your priority is to survive. And that is what the nervous system's primary programming is to promote your survival. So this area is responsible for pushing those fight or flight symptoms, or fight or flight reactions. But we should only be in fight or flight maybe at the most 10% of the day. And we rest and repair 90% of the day. But unfortunately in our society we kind of flip-flop those things, where now we're doing 90 here and 10 over on this side. So what we need to do is work out what potentially is causing some of this. All right, well, if we have an imbalance in these hemispheres, we end up having an issue, because what happens is the left side of the brain will fire down into these two areas in the brainstem that then together will come up and inhibit the fight or flight responses from the midbrain. and the right side does the same thing. Okay, and it inhibits this side. However, what can happen is if we lose the inhibition from one side, or the left side isn't working properly, we get what's called mesencephalic escape, or escape of these fight or flight functions, which now promote that fight or flight response, which takes away our rest and repair cycling, which then affects digestion, elimination, our ability to get nutrients, our ability to get oxygen to our system. Basically puts us in a situation where we're not promoting our survival very well. And when this left side isn't working as well as it should be, now the right side is like, well, if you're not going to do the job, I need to increase what I'm doing in order to make sure that we're functional, we can survive. So now the communication between the two lobes of the brain starts to diminish. And when we have that breakdown, that's when we start to see issues with individuals as adults, individuals as children. Because the left and the right side of your brain do different things. Different jobs. All right, the left side of the brain is, think of it kind of like the accelerator. Right side of your brain is kind of like the brake. So once again, a lot of times you see the kids that have ADHD issues, the right side of in their scenario, the right side of the brain is the side that's not working as well. So it's like there's no brake. So you have that hyperactivity component. Their thoughts are running, their emotions are out of control. That's a lot of things you see that is because the right hemisphere has become not working at the same speed or functional level as the left side does. I guess a good analogy would be to think of it as we have two engines up in our brain, or up in our head with the brains, the two hemispheres. If we can get the two to work together, we can be very efficient and do a lot of work. But if one of these is working at 5,000 RPM and this one's working at 10,000 RPM, you can see we can get a lot more. There's a tug of war that goes on between the two parts of the brain, which makes it very difficult for the person to function at the level they're potentially able to, because they're not gaining full access to all the different functions of the brain. Another good example is, or analogy, is you have a toolbox, and in each of those drawers is a tool that does a different function. But unfortunately for these children, and adults too, you can't get the drawers open. So instead of being able to use a hammer to do the job, you have to use the backside of a screwdriver handle. And you can still get the job done, but obviously it's not the right tool that you want to use, and over time that's what's not going to be the optimal one to be using anyways. So what we do with our functional neurology is look to see which of these drawers are closed and open them back up again for these kids through functional types of exercises, because we can do different things to stimulate different areas of the brain. We can use light, sound, taste, smell, touch. We can do muscle responses. We can do vibration. We can do all sorts of things to help stimulate the weaker side of the brain so that they're both working together. And when we see those things and we see this integration between the two lobes, that's when we get to see happy kids, happy parents, and a fulfilled life.